Avery Dickens de Hiron, and I would like to welcome everyone to our final panel of Brazil Week 2020, which has been entirely virtual. And so today's panel, as you all know, is on race in Brazil. It's an interdisciplinary panel, and I'd like to thank Celso Castillo for organizing it and for moderating it. And so I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Celso.
Thank you. So good afternoon. With that said, we're going to launch into 4 brief presentations, being mindful, of course, of time so that we can leave as much space at the end for discussion and questions. These are mostly snapshots into contemporary issues. One on affirmative action, another one on Black Lives Matters, another one on the memory and politics of slavery, and also on Brazilian collections and slave documentation projects that have been undertaken here and coordinated from Vanderbilt. So with that, each speaker will very briefly introduce themselves and get us going. We're going to begin with Professor Rhonda Collier.
Hi, everyone. Boa tarde. I'm Dr. Rhonda Collier from Tuskegee University in Tuskegee, Alabama. I did my PhD at Vanderbilt, and I completed in 2002, I believe. And I had the pleasure of working with Earl Fitz and Jane Landers and Marshall Aiken as members of my committee, and it's really good to be here with you. In 2001, I spent my dissertation writing year in Brazil, and this was the first year that they began to enact affirmative action policies. So as I was working with my topic, which was Afro-Brazilian women writers and how they understood nation through their writing, I was particularly interested in their access to citizenship and education. So the topic of affirmative action is something that I've just been following informally since its inception. Affirmative action in Brazil is 19 years old, with the first policies being enacted in Rio to allow 50% of vagas, spaces in the university under a quota system, and they say quotas in Brazil, to have spaces in the public universities in Rio. So it started off as a policy in Rio, then expanded to a national policy upheld by the Supreme Court in 2012. And in the policies, some of the key facts, and I'm going to share my screen here, some of the key policies had to do with the inclusion of the educational materials, Afro-Brazilian culture, art, and history, as well as the history of indigenous people in Brazil needed to be covered in not only the universities, but in the ensino médio, in the primary and secondary schools. So the larger policies, there are two aspects. One, jobs for people, positions in federal government, and then also the inclusion of educational materials so that people could understand the importance of African culture, African history, Afro-Brazilian literature, as well as indigenous culture and literature production in Brazil as a part of what I said at the beginning of this nation building process, educating everybody about the value of Black and Brown people in Brazil. So those are just kind of the basics, a 19-year progress. Currently, the current president, Bolsonaro, is not really a fan of affirmative action policies and has said some very negative things about Afro-Brazilians or Black and Brown Brazilians whining. So it's been a bit of a reversal, but laws are still upheld, and people are trying to teach these educational materials in their classrooms. And with my work in literature, I've worked with a lot of different people in Brazil about what types of materials they include and how these materials are received, and the training that professors now receive, so that and instructors too, on how to teach African culture, Black culture, indigenous cultures to younger students. Some of the issues that I'll outline here in terms of affirmative action in the university, students typically are studying education in the humanities. They are lacking access to medicine, engineering, and law, because those degrees require you to study during the day. And a lot of students who are Black and brown are also in economic disparity situations, so they need to work and go to school. And I'm talking about age 18 to 24. So one of the issues of affirmative action is being equal access to all subject fields. So if you can see, of course, in terms of income potential, those who would be studying engineering, medicine, and law would also earn higher incomes. So the access is there to enter the university, but while there are a lot of students, Black and brown students, face the challenges of they can't study certain things because those courses are offered when they need to work. So if you know anything about Brazilian public education, it is free, except you do have to pay for your books and your housing. You take a vestibular exam to get into the university. And when I was in Brazil in the early, in the late 90s, a lot of Afro-Brazilians, indigenous Brazilians had problems passing the vestibular to get in. So there's been a lot done to improve with the quotas, and also the high school education. There's been a lot done to help those students do better and to get into the university. In terms of the other aspect we talked about, teaching of the culture, there are some groups, particularly very religious groups, that protest the idea of teaching about candomblé and some African religions to their students. So in terms of book selection and representation, some members of society in Brazil do not want that education being taught to their students. So there's some conflict there, and I've done some work on that. The third bullet point I have here is there's typically, and this is different than it is in the United States, private universities typically have a poorer quality of education than public universities. So for example, I studied at USP, the Universidade de São Paulo. That is considered like the Harvard, a great university. And then some of the private schools, they don't have the same leverage, and they don't have the same level of education that you would receive at a public school. And that's kind of different than how we see it in the United States. The fourth bullet here that's been an issue with affirmative action in terms of admission into universities is fraud. People who are claiming that they are of African descent have been called out and said, no, you're not really Black. And I'm sure that may be something that my colleague will get into in terms of Black identity in Brazil. And we know that Brazil has a majority of Black people in the world outside of Nigeria, and 60% are African descendants. But in the case of these of affirmative actions, they want the person to be phenotypically Black. So they can go before a board and they are interviewed and pictures are taken and they're not Black. So some people who might have had a Black great grandmother or some Black in their family, they may not be considered Black, where in the United States they would be considered Black. So it's not just naming yourself as Black, but being accepted under the rigors of the quota system as Black. And then the last bullet here is the whole idea of affirmative action in Brazil is kind of counter the racial democracy, the myth of racial democracy of Brazil. And many critics have said that it has established racism. It has made race an issue in a country where race was an issue. But for those of us who've studied Brazil, we know that race has always been an issue. It just hasn't necessarily been in the national discourse as we're racist. Typically, it's called racismo cordial, a cordial racism, or like I said, the racial democracy. But still, statistically, the Black and brown people of Brazil have had less education and less access to education and wealth than white Brazilians have. But of course, in a society where the myth is everybody's mixed together and there is no definite black or white like we have in the United States, that's a problem. So affirmative action has highlighted racial identity and the criteria, and it also has developed more of a black and white, and that hasn't something that has traditionally been a part of the Brazilian dialogue. And then where are we now?
Rhonda,
So
if you could just start, if you can, like within a minute.
yes. Oh yeah, I have 1 minute. So just that right now, 10 years later, 30% and 60% of whites are studying in higher education, when in 1999, only 7% of blacks were studying. So the last thing I would like to point to you is, if you have a chance, read some of the Quilomboje writers. Cristiana Sobral has this great poem, it's called Black Eye. And in this poem, in the third stanza, she says, "I'm a black renegade, determined to face the system. I drum up the black without a hitch. I bum rush the stage." So we have a group of young activists in Brazil who are pursuing higher education. They're looking at it through the arts, and they're protesting, and they want to be a part of the national discourse through access to higher education and, of course, through excellent writing. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Demetrius Murphy, and I graduated from Vanderbilt in 2019 with my master's in Latin American Studies. And currently, I am a PhD student at the University of Southern California, getting a PhD in sociology. And so I'm going to be very brief. So the title of my presentation, my micro presentation, is Black Lives Matter, A Tale of Two Americas. And this is some preliminary findings. And so the brief agenda for today is to look at what Black Lives Matter is, what it means in Brazil, and then show how people are using it as a hashtag to link it to parallels that are happening in the United States, and then talk about the kind of complicated ways it's being used in Brazil. And so first, to start it off, I want to make for sure that we understand that Black Lives Matter is a hashtag. It's also an organization, and it's also a philosophy, right? And so there's a clear distinction between the organization and the philosophy. And currently, the organization of Black Lives Matter only has chapters in the United States and Canada. So there's no official chapter in Brazil. So when people suggest that Black Lives Matters, the organization, is operating in Brazil, it's somewhat a misnomer, right? People are operating under the hashtag of Black Lives Matter, and they're using the hashtag and they're using the philosophy that Black lives do indeed matter. But in terms of the actual organization, they are not Black Lives Matter. And in a way, it also obscures the kind of hard work that activists have been doing in Brazil for a very long time, right? And so what I want to point out here is the various ways that people have linked racial struggles in Brazil and racial violence in Brazil to the United States. So in 2019, Pedro Gonzales was brutally murdered in a grocery store. And as you can see on my screen where it says Brazil 2019, a security guard literally choked him to death. And what you see is people started to make parallels between Eric Gardner, who was also choked to death in the United States in 2014, to Pedro Gonzales in Brazil. And so on the far left-hand side of my screen, you see how people are connecting the two, literally putting the photos side by side and showing that this is both happening in the United States and in Brazil. And another very important thing is people are using the hashtag Vidas Negras Importam, right? And then if you go down the thread, you can also see where English speakers are also jumping in the conversation and making for sure that not only is this information being conveyed in Portuguese, but it's also being conveyed in English. And so across the board, you see how this particular instance was linked to similar instance in the United States, and it gained momentum through social media, right? And to the point where Black newspapers and Black media sites, including The Root, BET, and News One, even talked about the incident. Though I would argue they talked about it in somewhat problematic ways, they do talk about the incident. And so on May 2020, May 25th, we all know that George Floyd was brutally murdered by the Minnesota police. And that sent shockwaves throughout the world in terms of thinking about racial justice, thinking about racial violence. And in Brazil specifically, a lot of people started to link George Floyd's murder with murders in Brazil. And people use language such as, there are thousands of George Floyds in Brazil. We have a George Floyd every 23 minutes in Brazil. But what this does is it shifts the conversation in interesting ways, right? Because on May 14th, 2020, a young man named João Pedro Matos Pinto was killed by the police. But we didn't see the same type of outcry or publication, particularly in American news outlets, for this murder, right? And so I wanted to look and see what was happening on Twitter during this time frame, and what were people saying. And so I downloaded literally over 1 million tweets, as you can see at the bottom, and specifically using the hashtags Black Lives Matter, Vidas Negras Importam, in both English and in Portuguese, and then using them in combination in a tweet, right? And so the important thing I want to point out is, for all of these tweets that I downloaded, in total there was 100,000 that used the word George Floyd, and then there was 10,000 that used the word João Pedro, right? And so you can clearly see that George Floyd overwhelmed the amount of tweets that took place. And so a lot is happening. I know I only have a little bit of time, but one of the key things that I want to point out across the tweets is there's a very clear understanding in the tweets that this was about a murder. And at least in João's tweets, this was about a murder of a young boy, right? And the English. But one of the things that they kept pushing, if you look closely, it says share, petition, sign, right? So in their tweets, they were actively trying to get people to sign a petition, right? As a way to amplify the case that happened in Brazil. Whereas when you look at the tweets about George Floyd, you don't see anything similar about signing anything or a petition of any sorts. And then these are the Portuguese tweets, just for reference, to see kind of what people were saying. And so what you find is the petition that they were trying to get people to sign is this petition right here on the left-hand side of the screen, which was a change.org petition to draw attention to João Pedro's murder. And you can see there are over 3 million people have signed the petition. And also, very importantly, this petition is in English, right? Suggesting that they were trying to get to an international audience. But one of the issues that you quickly see is this is an uneven exchange, right? And it's not that folks in the United States completely understand what is happening in Brazil, but the strategy is, or Brazilians are using the hashtag Black Lives Matter and Vidas Negras Importam to amplify local issues and publicly shame Brazil on an international stage, which we know is effective. See Tiana Pachel's book about that. But as much as the strategy illuminates, it obscures as well. And international issues can overshadow and even usurp attention from local ones. And this is and I'll end on this. This is a quote from the Financial Times where a young woman is discussing at a march what's happening, right? And how people are using this notion of I can't breathe. But she said something very impactful. She said that rather than focusing too much on the United States, people here should pay more attention to the struggles of Black Brazilians, right? Which kind of echoes this notion that this is an uneven exchange And while it can be a powerful strategy for international attention, it also has downsides as well. And so I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great. So in picking up some of the strands that were just articulated by both Rhonda and Demetrius, Sociedade Vista is a project, it's an initiative spearheaded by university professors in the city of Bahia that also has these kind of both local and international resonances, right? So on the one hand, if you look at the group's statements on their site about, you know, what sparked this and all this, they will immediately point to not just George Floyd, but the ongoing and surrounding conversations that have been happening primarily in the US, but also in other parts of the world about the representations of slavery and questions of public space, right? So this group has taken on this kind of initiative of not only mapping important city sites that have slave registers. And here it's really important to emphasize that, you know, we are talking about Salvador Bahia. We are talking about a place that is, you know, often referred to as the African capital of the Americas, et cetera, the second largest slave trading port in the Americas. But this is actually emphasizing and pointing out slave owning histories of the city, right? Stuff that gets kind of made invisible over time and that isn't reckoned with, and it's part of this fueling of racial inequalities and these myths of this kind of racelessness belonging. So there's certainly that kind of international aspect to understanding this project. But I also want to emphasize here, and this is kind of picking up directly on what Demetrius was saying about the local parts of this, right? In so many ways, this is such a quintessentially Brazilian 2000s initiative and project, right? This is organized. When you look at the, you know, here, you can follow me, like I'm looking at the people that are involved in this. There are actually, if you look at the advisory board, there are only 2 people that I know of that have got PhDs before 2005. So what we're talking, and we're talking about also at least half of the people I know specifically personally are of Afro descent, right? So what we're talking about are people that are part of this generation that Rhonda talked about, that kind of came about in the public federal university system. A good number of them, I can point out here, Luciana Brito. She's actually been to Vanderbilt. We invited her with Jane and the Circumatlantic group in 2013, right? So these are students that as undergraduates in the mid to late 2000s participated, Luciana, for example, participated like in the COPY's 50 exchange, right? So spent a semester or a year at Howard. Also has come back during doctoral studies and spent time at I think also at NYU, and several of other students, like Felipe was at University of Chicago. Ana Flavia was also, I don't know exactly where she was, but she spent time. So all to say, these are folks that have direct contact, but are part of this moment in Brazilian higher education that has explicitly turned in its efforts at widening the student base, right? Diversity of efforts and inclusion. So in a lot of ways, I think that needs to be emphasized insofar as kind of the genesis of this project. And there's also a structural element here, right? So these are 23 university professors that work in and around the city of Salvador. One place at the Federal University of Bahia, which is, you know, the flagship school, Federal University in the state. But the two other schools that are involved in this around the city of Bahia are of the state university system, right? So you've got this new generation of faculty that are gaining these posts that are largely lifetime posts that are going to be influential in curricular debates and in these kind of public initiatives. And you have the Federal University in the Recôncavo, which is in the hinterlands of the city of Bahia, which is also, if not explicitly affirmative action, racial affirmative action, it's also part of an expansion of Brazilian higher education that happened in the 2000s, largely associated with Lula and the PTs. You know, that movement, right, of broadening and certainly in the north and northeast and underserved part of the countries. So like this, there are some interesting personal but also structural features to this project that I just wanted to emphasize and bring to light here as we start to think about this, because I think superficially one might think, yes, there's a, you know, the contestation of public memory, and that happens in places where there's slavery. I mean, yes and no, right? There are certain elements here that are important to highlight. So what they've done is they've taken on some of the, again, important, like more, somewhat iconic city sites and people that are associated with the city of Salvador. And they've tried to rewrite some text, and they're working to kind of put even some public markers to change the ways that people think about the city, right? The Barón de Cotegipe was a prime minister in the 19th century, also said to have been of some African descent, but he's nonetheless notorious from our standpoint for being the prime minister that was kind of most against abolitionism at the very end of the 1880s, right? So he kind of held the line at the very end. And these are people, as these scholars have all pointed out, they've kind of gone down in the history books as being famous for, being good businessmen, entrepreneurs, contributors to society, philanthropists, humanitarians, et cetera, right? All the euphemisms that their kind of life has been associated with some underlying connections and dependence on slavery and enslaved peoples have been made invisible, rendered invisible over time, right? And so they're also, they got here some, reparationist remembrances that are in place, right? And one being the famous Muslim slave revolt of 1835. And so it's a street that they're trying to kind of highlight as part of the city's heritage. The same thing with Luis Gama, famous abolitionist, Afro-Brazilian abolitionist that was illegally enslaved when he was a kid, 13 de Mayo, the date of Brazilian abolition. And then also kind of turning to places that have been kind of forgotten. And here, these are just different spaces in the city that they are trying to kind of appropriate and give this kind of value and meaning to, right? And then you read in interviews, why are you doing this, and what's the, what are the goals? And a lot of it is, I guess what would kind of fall within the kind of public service work from our own university context, right? I mean, it is to raise awareness. It is also, it's educational, right? For kids to kind of, these are not all of these, not the whole advisory board, but several of these people kind of grew up and are raising their kids in Salvador, and they don't want to have to kind of reproduce that same experience of, we live in a city that like values Afro and Black culture, but that it's still in some of its fundamentally structural ways hiding its ties and its dependence to slavery, right? So I think these are part of the motivations. So anyway, so that was my intention today, was just to kind of bring this project to light. It's ongoing. Like I said, it started with George Floyd, and around there it kind of crystallized. And so this is something that, I personally look forward to continuing to follow. On Facebook is their most active platform, I would say. There's actually a lecture tonight by Sidney Shalhoub of Harvard University. So these are just things to kind of think about when we're considering this kind of local but also international conversations and discussions of race. So I'll stop there and I'll pass it over to our colleague Jane Landers.
Thanks. Those are wonderful, all of those presentations. And I really want Rhonda and Demetrius to send us your PowerPoints, because we can then use all your hard work and spread the word, if you don't mind, because they were great. It's good to see you all again. So I'm going to not have a PowerPoint because I'm stuck in bed with a broken leg, but I am going to sort of recap the history of our connections to Brazil and race through some of the programs that Celso already mentioned, and Rhonda too, and I think you'll see connections to the others. As Celso mentioned a long time ago, we started a series of exchanges with 50 copies. We've had, I meant to look again, but it's about 50 Brazilian students over the years from different parts of Brazil that came and studied with us, and some of our students from the center who went down and studied in Brazil. And I think it was a wonderful beginning of a lot of networks of connections that continued all these years. So I thought that was important to mention, that we had written one last big grant on that, and it was going to focus also on African and indigenous people in Rio Grande do Sul. And we actually were approved by copies, and damned if Temer didn't cancel our money. So that one never happened. But it was a beginning to move into other areas of Brazil that we hadn't worked in as much. But all those students have now, as Celso pointed out, gone on to higher education posts of their own. And some of them we get to see again. Well, every time Marshall and Celso and I go back to Brazil, we have a dinner for all our alums that were here at Vanderbilt and stay connected to them. And some of them come back on bolsas de sandwiches when we had those. Those have been canceled as well. Or came on their, breaks to come back. Some applied to graduate school here. We didn't get to keep some of them, but at least it built a long-term network for us in a variety of institutions, educational institutions in Brazil. And the project directors would also come here, and we had meetings here that were funded by FIPSI copies. We had a conference here that Celso, Marshall, and I all worked on Africa and Brazil, and that was in response to what Rhonda focused on, the constitutional requirement to teach African history in Brazil. And so we were doing that kind of work as well with these projects before they finally ran out. Next, the other big project that connects us for many, many years now to Brazil is in 2002, I got the National Endowment Humanities Grant, International Challenge Grant, or Research Grant, I guess it was, with Marisa Soares at UFI and Paul Lovejoy at York. And that kicked off what we thought was just a one-shot deal to go down and digitally preserve Brazilian records in Rio. And we worked on ecclesiastical records. So they're the longest serial records for Africans anywhere in the world. And we started in Brazil, but our model has always been from 2002 on to take down training equipment and cameras and everything else we need, train the students in the work in international digital preservation standards, leave the equipment for them to use thereafter as they will, and they upload those documents and send them to us. So, and we pay them stipends while they're also working on these projects. So it's professional training, it's equipment, it's stipends to keep them in school, and then we check on them every time we get back to Brazil, and some of them are still connected to us. So that's been a wonderful project. We currently have, in addition to the work going on in the state of Rio, which is, multiple sites had sent their records into Rio, into the archival there. And so we find all kinds of unusual things we didn't think were even in existence anymore. And we have those preserved. Let's see, we're also working Paraíba, so that's mostly Marshall is the director of that, but Courtney Campbell, our graduate student, set that all up, and we still have materials coming in from there, and many of our graduate students also would go and get training and something for their CVs on these projects. And a little bit in Minas Gerais we have. Currently, I asked Daniel Jenkins, who's the executive director of our project now, we have, for just the Brazilian count, we have 807 volumes, 190,002 images, and when Courtney sends us the final hard drives and gets the metadata translated, we'll have even more. So if you figure 4 or 5 people who are getting baptized that day or married that day, add all the godparents, the priest, and the parents and the owners and everything in there, it's quite a huge population we have preserved the history for. And some of the documents that we started to do work on no longer exist in Brazil and Cuba because of the financial, issues and others. So sometimes these are the only things that remain of those histories. And then another thing that maybe on the educational front, many of the people that have worked with me on these projects, I got them all to write something about the work they did. And we had a special issue in the English journal Slavery and Abolition, which then they reprinted again as a special, as a book, or as a book. And so Maritza has one. I did the intro and I did a chapter. Courtney did a chapter. Kara Schultz did a chapter, and Angela Sutton. So I didn't realize it was all women, but it is. It was. So, and then the other last thing, I'm not sure how much my time, Celso. So the last thing is, the horrible tragedy of the fire in the museum in Rio. Maritza had just finished about a year before that a special exhibit of all the African art objects and material culture that was sent from Africa to Rio to the emperor. And then she did a tremendous research job cataloging everything and planning this exhibit. I think Marshall and I got to see it when we were there on one of these exchanges, and shortly thereafter, you all read it, got burned. But the wonderful, so everything, almost everything was lost. And all that remains is this wonderful catalog that Maritza organized, which was exactly to meet the challenge of teaching African history as required by the Constitution. So the catalog exists. It is up on the museum, the Rio Museum page in Portuguese, but with some of my money from some other things, we decided we would translate it into English to make it even more usable for everybody, and that we would put it up on our website. We're in the middle of that. Celia Grespan, our Brazilian friend, translated it for us, and then Marshall and I are supposed to be finalizing everything. I'm behind, but we will get that put up, and it'll be an international contribution of African Brazilian race history and material culture. And I just suggested that also to the UNESCO International and Scientific Committee for the slave route. I sent them the catalog and suggested that this might be something they would also want to put up on their website to give it even further visibility. So that's all I have, and I will leave the rest for questions. How about?
So I have a question, Celso. It seemed, I mean, this is not a coincidence that the Black Lives Matter movement has gone global at the same time as we're having this pandemic. I'm not sure of what my question is, except beyond maybe why. I mean, they are related, right? And I think we all sort of feel that, both in the States and internationally. So I put that out as an observation and welcome comments.
Demetrius, you want to take that or respond? I mean, just since you were.
Yeah, definitely. No, I agree, Ted. I do think they're related, and I do think that coronavirus forcing so many people to stay in the house and to have to engage online and engage through reading, particularly social media, right? It's allowed information that maybe would normally be glossed over to be seen. So I definitely think that's part of it. But then I think the other very important part of it is COVID has, for so many, made very salient the kind of disproportionate realities that a lot of people live, particularly based on race, right? And so it's gotten to the point now where it's hard to ignore, right? And so I think those two things coming together has made for a very poignant point in history. And so, yeah, I'm interested and excited to see where things go. And I really hope that this just isn't a moment that then fades away. And I'm really hoping some lasting structural and systematic changes happen.
Yeah, that's my hope too, because we're at this moment where a lot of things are possible. What the political scientists call the Overton window is really expanded, right? And yet it requires leadership to take advantage of those, to change the narratives, which then justify changing the structures. And that's what I'm worried about too, in Brazil and the US, right?
Ron, did you want to take that, and then we'll go to the question from Dr. Joy Gus?
Yeah, I was reading her question because it's such a fundamental question, and one of the reasons I began my work in comparative literature after reading about the first Black senator in Rio, Benedita da Silva, and I was amazed that I didn't know I'm older, everybody, so I didn't know as a young person about Blacks in Brazil. It wasn't something that was taught to me. And then when I became aware that this is a population that has the same history of enslavement, how could I not know? And now people know about Brazil and Blackness. But I guess in the 80s, I mean, even people like Ronald Reagan were saying, I didn't know they had Blacks in Brazil. And I think even Bush was ignorant of the fact of the makeup of the country. But in terms of the systematic racism, what is essential is in the United States, we had Jim Crow and we had the Reconstruction. So the racism in the United States is very structured and it's tied to legal to laws. In Brazil, that wasn't the case. When people were freed, they weren't told you couldn't go to the university, you couldn't work here. It was subtle, like an ad would say you have to be of good appearance, or you were not allowed access to things not because of your race so much, but because of your class. And it was always explained as class versus race structure in Brazil. That was the public discourse on racism. But anyone who's experienced slavery knows that as a result of enslavement, you are behind in terms of access to education, access to health. And what you're seeing now in this period, it's not just these things that happened 400 years ago impact us today, and people are still living the legacies of mental trauma, physical trauma, historic trauma, and this plays out in the United States, and it also plays out in Brazil. The only difference is the level of acceptance and the discourse around things like a racial democracy. Dr. Gus, a society saying, we're not racist. Or for example, when I began my work in Brazil, the term Afro-Brazilian in 1998 was not a common term. And even today, many Black Brazilians, they would like to be called negra. Eu sou negra. They don't necessarily say I'm Afro-Brazilian. So, and then of course in the United States, we had Negro, colored, the N-word, Black, African-American, Afro-American, all these different terms. People knew that they were Black and they identified as Black. There's a different type of a consciousness that developed for Black Brazilians. So there are many Black Brazilians that are my color that don't necessarily have a consciousness of a Black identity. So, so one is recognizing that the society in Brazil didn't necessarily structure itself on Black Brazilians and white Brazilians. And this also has to do with skin color too, because you could be pardo, you could be mulatto, you could be so many different terms. In the United States, you were Black even if you had one drop. So in terms of systematically, it was a medical, a societal, a structural, very formal thing in the US, and in Brazil, it was informal, which is really the beauty of affirmative action, is that in affirmative action, the society said, we're doing something wrong, we need to right the wrong, and this is how we're gonna do it specifically, and not just allowing people access, but informing everyone in the society about the contributions of Black and brown people. And that's one thing you said about differences. We have historically Black colleges in the United States. That's where I teach. And those institutions were largely charged with educating Black people about their own history. When I was growing up, I didn't learn anything about Black people except for slavery in school. My parents had to teach me everything else. So what I see that is the beauty of what Brazil is trying to do is saying that Black people don't exist just because of slavery. They have a heritage, an African heritage. Indigenous people have an indigenous heritage, and they want everyone to be aware of that. And that was not as strongly enforced in the United States in terms of teaching African history, teaching African American culture. Those things were not imposed as a part of affirmative action in the 70s. So we've been doing affirmative action since the 1970s in the US, and there has not been a mandate on how to teach these things. It's evolved, but it wasn't a part of the genesis of affirmative action in the US. The educational piece is key when you think about what Brazil is doing. And there's many problems in terms of race, in terms of economic disparity that you will see in Brazil, but the key is the recognition that something needed to be done, and it was late. It was the 21st century before they addressed it legally in Brazil with the affirmative action laws.
One more, Lydia?
Yeah, I have a question about the affirmative action and with intersectionality and affirmative action. So I'm wondering if Brazil has tackled not only affirmative action in a racial sense, but also in combination with socioeconomic or gender issues.
Yes, in terms of the economic issues they have, and they do have ways to look at a person's economic eligibility for certain access points. So that is a part, yes, very much. And women have had more prominence in the last, well, they've had their first female president at the same time that we had Barack Obama. So women's issues and economic disparity has been addressed.